In 1963, wrecking balls tore into Pennsylvania Station, a New York colossus of pink granite that had welcomed passengers since 1910. It covered 8 acres, its waiting room rivaled the baths of Caracalla, and it fell in months for an office tower and a sports arena. But Penn Station was only the beginning. Across America, cathedral-like terminals were dying too. Why would a nation demolish its most magnificent buildings? The answer starts with a single invention. Before that invention, stand inside what was lost. Pennsylvania Station was the work of McKim, Mead & White, the most celebrated architectural firm in America, designed to overwhelm you. The head of the project, Charles Follen McKim, had studied in Paris and toured Rome before drawing a single line. And he insisted the pink granite come from Milford, Massachusetts, hauled to Manhattan by the trainload. The main waiting room rose 150 feet, and 84 Corinthian columns framed a concourse of steel and glass that flooded the platforms with daylight. Demolition began in October 1963 and did not stop until the granite giant was gone. The contractor, a firm run by Morris Lipset, carted away the debris for scrap, and one crew foreman later admitted the stone was too soft to resell. 8 acres of Midtown Manhattan vanished, and in its place rose Madison Square Garden and a slab of office space. A building that took years to raise came down in a season. That death was not random. It happened because these stations had been built to be temples, and temples make tempting targets when faith runs out. The railroads that raised them did not want mere shelters for waiting travelers. They wanted monuments that announced their power the moment you stepped inside. Grand Central Terminal opened in 1913 and cost roughly $80 million, an astonishing sum for its day, every dollar spent to inspire awe. Its ceiling, painted by Paul Helou, showed a zodiac of 2,500 stars, 59 of them lit by electric bulbs, and the whole design was reversed, arranged as if seen from outside the heavens. Washington Union Station opened in 1907, designed by Daniel Burnham, the master planner who believed a great building should make no little plans. It stretched across some 200 acres of tracks and yards, and its great hall soared 96 feet beneath a gold-leafed coffered ceiling. And Penn Station's waiting room was modeled directly on Rome's baths of Caracalla, as if arriving in New York should feel like entering an empire. The Beaux-Arts style dominated those years, all soaring vaults and classical columns, because the railroads wanted civic pride carved in stone. At its peak, Penn Station handled more than 100,000 passengers on a single day, and during the First World War, troops marched through its concourse by the thousands on their way to the docks. Stone, however, does not defend itself. The moment those temples lost their worshippers, their beauty became a liability. And the worshippers began to leave the moment they got a better way to travel. The single invention that started it all had 4 wheels. The automobile did not steal passengers gently. It emptied the rails with the help of the federal government itself. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, signed by President Eisenhower on June 29th of that year, funded 41,000 miles of interstate highways, a concrete lattice that reached everywhere a train once did, and many places it never could. The bill authorized $25 billion in federal money, the largest public works program the country had ever seen, and the government paid 90 cents of every dollar. Car registrations in the United States soared past 60 million by the 1950s. Rail passenger miles, which had peaked during the Second World War at roughly 95 billion in 1944, dropped sharply once the war ended and the highways opened, falling by more than half within 15 years. The highways did more than move people faster, they moved people away. Suburbanization pulled populations out of the city cores where the great terminals stood, and a family with a car in the driveway had little reason to walk into a marble hall and buy a ticket. Levittown, New York, built on Long Island potato fields beginning in 1947, sold 17,000 houses and became the model copied across the country. Between 1950 and 1970, American suburbs added tens of millions of residents while central cities stagnated or shrank. The temples were built for a crowd that was scattering to the edges of the metropolis. If the car wounded the railroads, the airplane finished the job. The blow was faster, and it fell on the routes that had once been the most glamorous, the long cross-country journeys. Jet passenger service began with the Boeing 707 in 1958, and the arithmetic of travel changed overnight. Pan American flew the first commercial 707 from New York to Paris that October, and the aircraft cruised at nearly 600 miles an hour, twice the speed of the propeller planes it replaced. Air passenger numbers surged through the 1950s and 1960s as tickets became affordable for ordinary people. By 1958, the airlines carried more intercity passengers than the Pullman sleeping cars that had once defined luxury travel, and within a few more years, planes overtook the railroads entirely on long routes. A trip across the continent that once took days aboard a train shrank to hours in the sky. The 20th Century Limited, the famous overnight run between New York and Chicago, took 16 hours. A jet made the same trip in under 3. No dining car, no sleeper berth, and no cathedral station could compete with that speed. Faced with empty seats, the railroads slashed passenger schedules, and every canceled train made the vast terminals feel emptier still. Emptier terminals meant a brutal financial truth, and by the 1950s it was impossible to hide. Passenger service had become a hemorrhage, and the railroads wanted nothing more than to escape it. Penn Station in particular was bleeding money. Penn Station operated at heavy annual losses by that decade, reported at more than $1 million a year in maintenance alone, and the Pennsylvania Railroad looked at its magnificent building and saw only a bill. The maintenance costs for these enormous terminals ran into the millions every year, and the company losing money on tickets had no appetite to pay them. So it stopped paying. Deferred maintenance left the Grand Hall sooty and dim, the marble grimy, the great windows clouded. By the late 1950s, the railroad had leased the vast concourse floor to advertisers, and a giant clamshell ticket booth and glowing signs cluttered the once clean space. The temple was allowed to decay so its owners could justify its death, and they had spotted something worth far more than a clean waiting room. What they had spotted was the ground itself. The land beneath the terminals had become worth more than the buildings upon it, and once that was true, the buildings were doomed. In New York, the value was staggering. Midtown Manhattan real estate values skyrocketed after the war, and the 8 acres under Penn Station became some of the most coveted earth on the planet. In 1962, the Pennsylvania Railroad announced its deal with developer Irving Mitchell Felt, whose firm agreed to pay the railroad an estimated $2 million a year for the air rights, plus a share of the new complex. The railroad sold the air rights above the tracks, and that deal produced the Madison Square Garden complex that opened in 1968, a drum-shaped arena seating some 20,000 and a 29-story office tower called Two Penn Plaza. Urban land pressure now targeted station footprints everywhere, because an air rights deal promised steady rental income unlike the unreliable trickle of ticket sales. A dead building that generated rent was worth more than a living one that generated nostalgia. The math was cold, and it was winning. That same math was being done in boardrooms across the country, with the same results. Urban renewal, the great post-war faith in clearing the old to make room for the new, swept the terminals away city by city. Penn Station was not alone. It had company in ruin. Detroit's Michigan Central closed in 1988 and then stood as a hollow, window-shattered skeleton for decades, its 18-story tower stripped by scavengers of copper and marble. Chicago's Grand Central Station was demolished in 1971, its Norman clock tower and Wells Street facade reduced to rubble. Buffalo Central Terminal, a 17-story Art Deco tower, opened in 1929, closed in 1979, and was left to rot after the last train pulled out on October 28th of that year. Across the nation, dozens of Union stations were razed between the 1950s and the 1970s, each a temple a city decided it could no longer afford. But something changed after Penn Station fell, and it began with a feeling that was hard to name. That feeling was shame. Penn Station's destruction sparked national outrage, and that outrage redefined what the whole episode meant. What had looked like ordinary progress suddenly looked like a crime. Architectural historians called it civic vandalism, and the phrase stuck. The New York Times mourned the loss in editorials, one declaring in October 1963 that the city would be judged by the monuments it destroyed, and that any city gets what it deserves. Even before the wrecking began, a protest group called AGBANY, the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York, had picketed the site in August 1962, led by young architects including Norman Jaffe and Diana Goldstein, carrying signs outside the doomed colossus. Among the marchers was the noted architect Philip Johnson, then in his 50s, who joined the picket line in a suit. Their fight failed. The station came down anyway. But as the drab office tower and the round arena rose in its place, the public shame only deepened. People looked at what they had gained and understood exactly what they had traded away. That shame did not stay a feeling. It became law. The backlash over Penn Station gave birth to America's modern historic preservation movement, and the change came quickly. New York City created its Landmarks Preservation Commission in 1965, signed into being by Mayor Robert Wagner in April of that year, a body with the power to say a beautiful building could not simply be sold and smashed. The National Historic Preservation Act passed in 1966, extending the idea across the entire country and establishing the National Register of Historic Places. And the commission soon turned to protect the terminal most at risk of becoming the next Penn Station. Grand Central was designated a landmark in 1967. The railroad that owned it, now the merged Penn Central, did not accept that quietly. It sued for the right to build a tower crashing down through the roof of its own protected landmark, a 55-story office block designed by the architect Marcel Breuer that would have gutted the terminal's facade. The fight went all the way to the top. The top was the Supreme Court of the United States, and the case would decide the fate of every surviving terminal in America. Penn Central Transportation Company against New York City was decided in 1978. Everything hung on whether a city could forbid an owner from destroying a private building for the public good. The court said it could, by a vote of 6-3, with Justice William Brennan writing the majority opinion. It upheld the landmark protection of Grand Central Terminal, ruling that preservation law was a legitimate exercise of a city's power and not an unlawful taking of property. That decision cemented preservation law nationwide. Grand Central would stand, and not merely as a grimy relic. It was later given a full restoration in the 1990s, its ceiling of stars scrubbed clean, its concourse returned to glory. The ruling proved a building could be saved, and something larger. That demolition had never been inevitable. That lesson began to raise the dead. Some of the lost giants, the ones that had merely closed rather than fallen, were reborn. Demolition was a choice, and so was resurrection. Washington Union Station, Burnham's masterpiece, was restored and reopened in 1988 after a $160 million rescue, alive again with travelers and shops beneath its coffered ceilings. St. Louis Union Station, once the busiest terminal in the world, with 32 tracks under its vast train shed, became a hotel and an attraction rather than a scar after a renovation completed in 1985. Grand Central's restoration was completed in 1998 at a cost near $200 million, and workers scrubbed away decades of tobacco grime to reveal that the ceiling's dark stain had been cigarette smoke, not soot. And in the most improbable rescue of all, Detroit's Michigan Central, that decayed skeleton, reopened after Ford Motor Company poured a fortune more than $900 million into its restoration in 2024. The ruin everyone assumed would be dynamited instead came back to life. These revivals tell us what the demolitions really were. They were not acts of nature or necessity. They reveal how a nation, for a few reckless decades, traded permanence for the promise of progress, and often got neither. Consider where Penn Station ended up. Its shattered ruins, all that pink granite and carved stone, were dumped in the New Jersey Meadowlands, a swamp graveyard for a masterpiece. The private passenger railroads that once built such temples collapsed entirely, and the government stepped in to form Amtrak in 1971 to keep any long-distance trains running at all. That is how completely the old order fell. Yet the story did not end in the swamp. Preservation now protects hundreds of historic stations that would once have been easy prey for the wrecking ball. And in 2021, New York opened a new Moynihan Train Hall, a soaring glass concourse built to reclaim a measure of the grandeur it had thrown away almost 60 years before. The city that killed Penn Station spent generations trying to atone for it. So when you ask why America demolished its most magnificent buildings, the answer is not the car alone, nor the jet, nor the accountants, nor the developers. It was all of them, marching under one banner and one belief. Progress demolished America's grandest cathedrals. But the same shame that let them fall built the laws that now keep the survivors standing. A nation learned, too late for Penn Station, that some things are worth more than the ground beneath them. If you would like to walk through more lost and rescued wonders like these, consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey.